Okay, two questions I want to talk about. The first is this issue of whether reasonable disagreements are possible in the relevant sense. Rich thinks that such disagreements are not possible. I'm inclined to agree with him about that. I worry that neither one of us ultimately has much of an argument for this as opposed to a shared, strongly held intuition about certain cases. Second question is whether an awareness of disagreement, the relevant kind of disagreement, whether there's a skeptical argument based on that fact, or whether this fact should push us towards kind of agnosticism. And Rich seems to think that there is a skeptical argument, that he has a lot of sympathy for at least. Against this, I'm going to defend a version of the hardline view. So I don't think that the argument Rich offers is a good one. I'm going to try to say what I think is wrong with it. I think, so my other fellow commentators also disagree with Rich, so maybe we're trying to maximize disagreement to provide data for the discussion. But I think I'll actually be conceding a lot more of Rich's in arguing against his argument. I'll be conceding a lot more of his general framework. So, for example, unlike Mike, I'm prepared to concede, at least for argument, that I should weight equally the way things seem to me and the way things seem to my epistemic peer. So, but first, are reasonable disagreements possible? Rich is dubious about the possibility of reasonable disagreements. He mentions a number of prominent philosophers, among them Gideon Rosen and Peter Van Inwagen, who seem to endorse the view that such disagreements are possible, and indeed that such disagreements sometimes occur. I think he also could have mentioned some other, even more prominent, not to take anything away from them, but some even more prominent people who also either thought or were committed to thinking that such disagreements are possible. Interestingly, many of the relevant people here considered themselves philosophers of science, and I think this is no accident. I have in mind especially Thomas Kuhn and Rudolf Carnap, who Oswaldo mentioned. The way in which such philosophers thought about rationality or reasonableness is, I think, quite different from the way Rich tends to think about it. It's also quite different from the way I tend to think about it, which is quite close to Rich's way. But so ultimately I'm going to set these figures to one side to engage with Rich more directly in talking about the skeptical argument, but at least mention this tradition of thinking. Consider two eminent scientists, both of whom are thoroughly acquainted with all of the available evidence which bears on some theory. One believes the theory, the other does not. Perhaps the second scientist believes some different, alternative theory. Must one of the two be more rational or reasonable than the other? I suspect that, at least at first blush, the most natural answer to this question is the one which Rich favors. Yes, one of them being more reasonable than the other if they hold incompatible theories. Much 20th century philosophy of science shied away from this natural answer, however, in part because of a growing awareness of just how often eminent, fully informed, and seemingly rational scientists have disagreed in history of science. Typically, accounts of rationality which allow for the possibility that both scientists are equally reasonable in their beliefs have involved the relativizing rationality to something. Thus, Kuhn would maintain that both scientists might be reasonable because rationality is relative to a paradigm, and the two scientists might be operating within different paradigms. Similarly, Carnap would maintain that both scientists might be rational because rationality is relative to a linguistic framework, and the two scientists might have different linguistic frameworks. The Carnap of a later period might say instead that the two scientists might both be rational in virtue of using different confirmation functions or occupying different positions along the continuum of inductive methods. For the contemporary Bayesian, what is rational to believe at a given time is relative to one's prior probability distribution. The two scientists might thus be rational in virtue of possessing different prior probability distributions. There are, of course, important differences among these accounts of rationality. But notice that they each possess the same structure. What it's reasonable for one to believe depends not only on one's total evidence, but also on some further feature F, one's linguistic framework, one's confirmation function, one's prior probability distribution, and so on. Because this further feature F can vary between different individuals, reasonable disagreements are possible even among those who have exactly the same evidence, who, if asked what their total evidence was, would correctly give exactly the same list. I think that this relativizing conception of rationality is quite alien to Rich. As I said, I find it rather alien as well. One naturally wants to ask, which framework, paradigm, prior probability distribution, is it more reasonable to use? If one framework is more reasonable than the others, then it looks like that's the framework that determines what it's reasonable to believe absolutely. On the other hand, if two or more competing frameworks are equally legitimate, then shouldn't one be agnostic between them? That is, wouldn't choosing one over the other be simply arbitrary and therefore unreasonable? However, it's absolutely central to the conception of rationality at issue that these sorts of questions are not legitimate questions. They might look like perfectly legitimate questions, but this appearance is spurious. This is because the notion of rationality only gets substantive content within a particular framework or paradigm or whatever. That is, what counts as good evidence for a claim depends upon which framework one is in. That's why for Kuhn, adherents of different paradigms can find themselves in disputes over the epistemic significance of a given phenomenon, where the dispute is simply not susceptible to rational adjudication, even in principle. But what counts as passing a crucial test or resolving a pressing anomaly, according to one paradigm, might count as weak evidence or no evidence at all, according to another. One might think that one can stand outside of all frameworks and ask questions about which of two incompatible frameworks is superior. But, such thinkers would insist, the sense that one can do this is illusory. In the relevant circumstances, one is at best standing in some third framework and judging the other two according to its standards. Obviously, this raises large issues that are far beyond the scope of anything that I can say here. I don't think that Rich really engages with this relativizing move much, and I don't intend to engage with it either, but in the spirit of our topic, I thought that it might be worth mentioning this tradition of thinking about rationality, given that it seems, as an historical matter at least, to be one of the main ways extremely smart people tend to get to this conclusion that reasonable disagreements are possible. So, I should mention Paul Boghossian's paper against epistemic relativism. Maybe that's the argument that Rich and I would need to kind of resist these guys. It's not clear to me. He might mean something narrower than I have in mind, because when I threw out to him that, aren't subjective Bayesians examples of epistemic relativists, he thought that they weren't, in his sense. So they're kind of a paradigm of who I have in mind here. Why might one think that reasonable disagreements are impossible? One reason would be if you accepted something like Rich's thesis U. I think, so this is the uniqueness thesis. I think that's a pretty strong thesis. Might be true, might not be. I don't think, as Rich kind of hints at, I don't think he needs, for his argumentative purposes, anything that strong. I think what he really needs is something like U prime, where U prime is, you have a given body of evidence. This can't be reasonable. We have the same total evidence, and I believe P, and you believe not P, and we're both reasonable, right? So even if it's reasonable, but belief and abstention, sometimes it could be vague, and either one could be permissible. You couldn't have this much vagueness. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to, like I said, I don't have any argument against these kind of relativizers. You can give examples to kind of make it look really bad and embarrass them, but you're not really telling them anything about their view that they don't already know and accept, I think. Okay, so now I want to turn to this main issue of skepticism. So, Rich thinks there's a powerful argument for skepticism in cases of the relevant kind. That is, once we become aware of our situation, that we have the same total evidence and we disagree in this way, we ought to abandon our respective beliefs and withhold or abstain on the issue in question. If either of us simply maintains his or her original belief in the face of the disagreement, he or she is unjustified in doing so. In the relevant circumstances, agnosticism is the uniquely justified stance. I don't think this is true. In fact, I'm an enthusiastic advocate of what Rich calls the hardline view. Okay. So here, the letters are going to come kind of fast and furious. So if you have my handout, that might be helpful. Let E represent your total evidence with respect to some proposition H at time t0. Let's stipulate that E is such as to justify the belief that H. Recognizing this fact, you form the justified belief that H at time t1. So this is an instant later. You form this belief in response to having E at time t0. Suppose further that at time t0, my total evidence with respect to H is also E. To keep things simple, let's suppose that each of us is totally ignorant of the other's existence at this point. So we're not sharing evidence, which suggests both that we have the same evidence, but also we arrived at the same evidence by kind of coming together. We just happen to have the same total evidence, which I assume is at least logically possible. So I have evidence E as well. Unfortunately, however, I badly misjudge the probative force of the evidence E at time t1. Not only don't I come to believe that H, but I instead take up the unjustified belief that not H. So we're just stipulating that E supports, given the character of E, it supports H, and it doesn't support not H. At time t1 then, prior to our learning about the other person, the situation stands as follows. You hold the justified belief that H on the basis of your total evidence E, while I hold the unjustified belief that not H on the basis of my total evidence E. The asymmetry in the epistemic status, or epistemic statuses of our respective beliefs is due simply to the fact that E really does support H, and it doesn't support not H. If we ask how, if at all, we should revise our respective views at time t1, the answer to this question seems clear. You should retain your justified belief that H, and I should stop believing not H and start believing H, since X hypothesized this is what a correct appreciation of the evidence, of my evidence, would lead me to do. I take it that this is exactly what a Feldmanian evidentialist would say about our situation. I myself think that this is the correct account. So far, so good. For Rich, things change dramatically once we become aware of our disagreement. Suppose that the relevant discovery takes place at time t2. So now we meet and we see, we've got the same total evidence, we compare notes, and you're believing H, I'm believing not H. What should we do? Once I learn that you, my epistemic peer, believes H on the basis of E, I should abandon my belief that not H. That I should abandon my belief is perhaps not at all surprising, given that my believing not H has been unjustified all along. I should have abandoned it even before we met, and indeed should never have formed it in the first place. But similarly, once you learn that I disagree with you at time t2, you are rationally required to abandon your previously justified belief at H and adopt an attitude of abstention or withholding as well. Notice that on Rich's account of how all this works, once we learn of our disagreement, things are perfectly symmetrical between us. Each should abandon his previous belief, whether it was originally justified or unjustified, and become an agnostic with respect to the question. Of course, immediately before we became aware of the disagreement, there was an extremely significant asymmetry between us. You were justified in believing H on the basis of E. I was unjustified in believing not H on the basis of E. One of the things that should make us extremely suspicious of Rich's skeptical argument, I think, is that this fact, who was right and who was wrong about the original first-order evidence E back at time t1, seems to drop out completely once we learn of our disagreement at time t2. Once two epistemic peers share their evidence and become aware of their disagreement, the bearing of the original evidence E seems to not to matter at all. Both parties should become neutral. So I think this is that the actual bearing of the original evidence E on the question is kind of an extremely surprising fact. Indeed, I'm especially surprised, this relates to some things Mike said, that this would have much appeal to an evidentialist like Rich. So I'll turn to this point below. On this question, the question of the relevance or irrelevance of the character of the original evidence, Rich's view contrasts sharply with the hardline view that I favor. According to the hardline view, the fact that there's an important normative asymmetry between us at the earlier time t1, you're correctly appreciating the evidence and I'm not, can potentially carry over and create a normative asymmetry between us at time t2. According to the hardline view, you might be justified in maintaining your original belief while I'm not, because you are in fact doing a better job evaluating the evidence than I am. No doubt, especially in the kinds of cases at issue, it can often be a non-trivial, difficult intellectual question to determine what the totality of evidence, of available evidence, supports. Therefore, it will often be a non-trivial, difficult intellectual question to determine which of us, if either, is doing a better job evaluating the evidence. But life is tough. Here as elsewhere. And any plausible conception of evidence will be, I think, extremely fallible with respect to questions about what our evidence supports. If Williamson is right, this fallibility runs deep, and there's these kind of in-principle limitations about our ability to fully appreciate our evidence. Even if if you disagree with Williamson on this point, I think you should agree that, in fact, we'll be highly fallible with respect to appreciating our total evidence when our total evidence consists of a whole number of arguments or diverse considerations. So any plausible conception of evidence will be extremely fallible with respect to questions about what our evidence supports. The amount of disagreement that we find among well-informed individuals simply makes that fact more salient than it would otherwise be. The most extreme hardline view would hold that, given that you originally responded to the evidence E in what is in fact the epistemically appropriate way, the mere fact that you now know that I believe not H is no reason for you to be any less confident of your view. So this might be the kind of view that Mike was sketching at the end, where you're not obligated to give any weight to the dissenting view of your epistemic peer. You kind of look through your epistemic peer and just at the first order consideration. That is, as long as one's belief is based on a correct recognition of what we all agree is the totality of first order considerations, then the mere fact that some epistemic peer, me, in effect tells you what's actually false, that E does not support H, you're not obligated to be any less confident of your belief. So I have considerable sympathy for this most extreme version of the hardline view. I have some arguments for this, but I'm not going to go into it. I think it's needlessly controversial in this context. And what follows, this will be the last thing, I'll argue that even if we accept a considerably more moderate version of the hardline view, according to which one ought to give at least some weight to the considered judgments of one's epistemic peers in revising one's own beliefs, the strong skeptical conclusion that Rich argues for doesn't follow. So here, this is under a better model on the handout. According to the version of the hardline view in question, when I learn that you believe that H on the basis of E, I should treat this fact as some evidence that E does support H. So this is conceding a version of Rich's evidence of evidence as evidence principle. So the picture here might be something like the following. If I knew with certainty that I had evaluated the evidence correctly, then I really could write off my epistemic peer who disagrees. But of course, in the actual circumstances, I'll have some reason, well, who's getting it right, who's getting it wrong. So maybe when I run into this epistemic peer who's coming on down the opposite side, this is a reason to hedge a little bit and reduce my confidence somewhat, right? So I treat the higher order evidence, I treat my epistemic peer's view as higher order evidence, evidence about the quality of the first order evidence. Thus, I should be at least somewhat less confident that not H is true than I was previously. Similarly, when you learn that I believe that not H on the basis of E, you should treat this fact as some evidence that E supports not H, so you should be at least somewhat less confident that H is true. Notice that, on the view in question, you ought to reduce your confidence that H is true, even though from a God's eye point of view, your original judgment was right and mine was wrong. Rationality requires that you treat the fact that I believe as I do as higher order evidence about the normative upshot of the first order evidence E, even though my belief is in fact misleading higher order evidence about the character of E. At this level, things are perfectly symmetrical between us. According to the view in question, once we learn that we disagree, our total evidence has changed. Initially, at time t0, the total evidence which is available to each of us is E. After we've become aware of our disagreement at time t2, our total evidence is now E prime. What gets included in E prime? It's natural to think that E prime consists of the following three things. So E prime is the original first order evidence E, that's now a subset of our new total evidence. Also included in E prime is the fact that you believe H on the basis of E, and the fact that I believe not H on the basis of E. Now, what attitude should you and I have toward H at time t2? The evidentialist will say, I think, correctly I think, whatever attitude is justified by the new total evidence E prime. What will E prime justify us in believing? That'll vary depending on the case. The crucial fact here is the following. There's no reason to think, as far as I can see, that abstention or withholding, that is, agnosticism about the issue in question, will invariably be the appropriate response to the new evidence E prime. Or at least, Rich hasn't provided us with a reason to think that this is so. In some cases, of course, abstention might very well be the appropriate response to E prime, even if it wasn't the appropriate response to the original evidence E. For example, suppose that although the original evidence E was sufficient to justify your belief that H at time t1, it was just barely sufficient to do so. If it had been any weaker, then you ought to have abstained or withheld rather than believe. In these circumstances, when you learn that I believe that not H at time t2, then given that we want to count this, as we might, as some genuine evidence for not H, it's likely that your new evidence E prime will tip the scales and mandate an attitude of abstention. You ought to give up your belief that H, since it's no longer adequately supported by your new total evidence. On the other hand, suppose that the original evidence E more strongly supported your belief that H. When you subsequently learn that I believe that not H, this again counts as some genuine evidence for not H. So you ought to be at least somewhat less confident of your belief. But it doesn't follow from this that you're rationally required to give up your belief entirely. In these circumstances, E prime might still justify the belief that H. An important point here. We should expect that in the usual case, the probative force of the new evidence E will depend a great deal on the probative force of the original. Sorry, I messed this up. In the usual case, the probative force of the new evidence E prime will depend a great deal on the probative force of the original evidence E. The original evidence E doesn't simply go away or become irrelevant once we learn what our epistemic peers believe on the basis of that evidence. It continues to play a role as an important subset of the new total evidence E prime. In general, what one is not and is not justified in believing on the basis of E prime will depend a great deal, though perhaps not entirely, on the character of the first order evidence E. Rich seems to think that there's some purely formal reason for thinking that one must withhold or abstain in cases of the relevant kind. That is, once we know that you believe H and I believe that not H, we're both rationally required to abandon our beliefs and retreat to agnosticism, regardless of the actual content of E. That's what I think isn't right. So all this is by way of saying I think premise E is the one we should reject in Rich's argument. That's one other note quickly. One reason I think Rich's Dean example is potentially misleading or at least potentially dangerous is I think we should be careful about treating a perceptual case or a non-inferential case, treating that, assuming uncritically that gets treated exactly the same as a discursive case where there's some body of evidence and argument that we're responding to. That actually seems plausible to me, so take a slightly different case. If you and I are watching a race, a horse race or something, and our background knowledge is we have equally good eyesight, so we're kind of the analogs of epistemic peers, and it's kind of a bang-bang finish, and the two horses cross the finish line almost at the same time, and it looks to me, I'm inclined to believe that horse A crossed just ahead of horse B, and I asked Rich, and turns out Rich thought horse B finished just ahead of horse A. Here I think there's a really strong case to saying, yeah, we should become agnostics. Notice in this case, there isn't this body of arguments, evidence. I mean, there's the evidence that we have equally good eyesight, but there isn't, as in the philosophical, say, the case of the philosophical controversy, where there's a whole body of arguments, you might think, that also, I think, needs to play a role in what it's reasonable to believe. So, thank you.